here can enjoy during and also after the panel. But yeah, thank you for coming today in person as well as virtually from somewhere else. Today's soup is hosted by the Center for Peacemaking, and our moderator is Father Michael McNulty. Father Michael is a native of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and entered the Jesuits in 1965. He joined the philosophy faculty at Marquette University in 1973 and retired in 2004, leaving Milwaukee for advocacy work with the Center of Concern and the Conference of Major Superiors of Men in Washington, D.C. He returned to Marquette in the summer of 2015. Sorry, yeah, there's a few sound issues. Yeah, sorry about the interruption. He returned to Marquette in the summer of 2015 as scholar in residence with the Center for Peacemaking. We're now headed over to Father Michael to help facilitate today's exciting program in honor of Ignatian Year. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. The Universal Apostolic Preferences were formulated in 2019. I'll give you just a little bit of background. The Society of Jesus is a worldwide religious order of men founded in the 16th century by St. Ignatius Loyola. Throughout its history, it has been characterized by an affirmation of the goodness of creation and a willingness to engage people and societies in order to transform them through the assurance of God's unconditional love expressed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Universal Apostolic Preferences are the result of 16 months of a process of discernment carried out by Jesuits across the globe. The Society is organized geographically into 6 conferences, and given its cultural diversity, it was amazing to the participants that in the process how much agreement there was. The preferences are: 1, to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises of discernment; 2, to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice; 3, to accompany young people in the creation of a hope-filled future; and 4, to collaborate in the care of our common home. The preferences represent not so much goals as guiding principles for decision-making for all Jesuit works and institutions, including Marquette, for the next 10 years. In the words of Father General Arturo Sosa, the preferences seek to embody concretely the mission received as the Lord's response to the cry of a wounded world, the cry of the most vulnerable who have been displaced and marginalized, the empty rhetoric that divides, that dismantles our cultures, the growing chasm between rich and poor, the cry of the young in search of hope and meaning, the cry of the earth and its peoples who have been degraded to the point of having their very existence put to risk. The preferences seek to respond to a world in which entire generations have never heard about Jesus and the gospel. Now, the preferences emphasize action, to show the way, to walk with the poor, to accompany young people, to collaborate and care. And they are interconnected. Each depends in multiple ways on the others. In what follows, each of the panelists will present one of the preferences. At the end, there should be ample time for discussion and questions. The other panelists are Father John Schwantes, who was ordained in Milwaukee in 1969. He was actively involved in the Black community for 20 years and served as deacon in a black parish in St. Louis. From 1997 to 2000, John was on the staff of the Sioux Spiritual Center in South Dakota. And from 2001 to 2015, he was on the staff of the Jesuit Retreat House in Oshkosh. Most recently, he has worked at the Faber Center at Marquette University. Father Greg O'Mara has been rector of the Marquette University Jesuit community since May of 2020. He was previously on the faculty of Marquette University Law School, a position to which he has returned after serving as rector of the Jesuit community at Creighton University, where he also served as a professor of law in the Creighton University Law School. He recently completed a sabbatical at the University of California at Berkeley, where he researched law and sociology and questions of legal ethics. Father José Miguel Jaramillo has been a member of the Jesuit province of Ecuador since 1999. He has a background in philosophy, ethics, and politics, and is currently completing a PhD in educational policy and foundations at Marquette University. His key interests include education, theology, community, communication, and human development. He also served as a member of a think tank that was formed by the Jesuit provincials of Latin America to study and advise on ecology and indigenous religions. So the first preference, to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment. Father John Schwantes.
Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me? Well, I'm glad to be here. I found it really helpful to reflect even more on these apostolic preferences or apostolic orientations, because I found them incredibly inspiring for an old Jesuit. You know, I thought, well, I was a younger Jesuit. Now this is really getting good. But yeah, they're really inspiring. They're energizing and very, I think, liberating, opening our hearts and minds. And so I will just take this first apostolic preference of showing a way to God, especially through the spiritual exercises, and to what's the last one? Oh yeah, discernment in common, which was my most important point. But the first part is very simple. When it says, showing a way to God. And the idea was that there's not to impose anything on anybody, but to give each person, to encourage each person to be really aware of what it is that really moves them. What are they committed to? What is something bigger than themselves that motivates them and orients their life? And so that operates in people's lives in a lot of different ways. And so the first part, and I think all through the apostolic preferences, there's this spirit of openness, hopefulness, joy, a sense of God is at work. We just need to be open to let that come into our lives. So that's why just to show a way to God. The next one is, I usually add the word especially through the spiritual exercises, since there's many ways and there's many paths to God. And the Catholic Jesuit University, influenced by Ignatius, obviously then the spiritual exercises are the primary method that Ignatius enabled people to begin to discover God in their lives and in their hearts, and then through basically enabling a person or inviting a person to get in touch with their deepest desires, their deepest longings, or what he called affections, the deepest part of ourselves. And then when we get in touch with that, we then will begin to hear God. And Ignatius, was encouraging people to then come to that interior freedom that enable them to choose, well, how is God calling me at this time in my life? In what ways am I've been invited to make a difference in the world, in the world, as what we say at Marquette U. So that's in terms of the spiritual exercise for individual. It's a pedagogy of transformation and pathways to that interior freedom, because we all have lots of ideas and desires and purposes, but they're also conflicted at times. So how can I be? Ignatius wants people to come to that interior freedom, so that when they do hear God calling them, then they will say yes. my whole vocation of the judge was mostly God calling me to one thing and me not wanting to do it. And then always, and finally, you know, I find that kind of openness. And I think that's what the spiritual exercises are about. The second thing I want to just simply say is, so they're about, you know, coming to an interior knowledge and then discernment, making choices that are in line with what God would hope for us. The other thing I want to just talk about, and Mike already hinted at, this whole process of coming up with the universal apostolic preferences was a process of communal discernment. You know, it's a Jesuit value, but we rarely practice it. And so this time, for whatever reason, I think the Holy Spirit, they just decided to look at what should the Society of Jesus be emphasizing in all its apostolic works, and with our colleagues in all these ministries, like here at Marquette, what should be the focus? And so they would ask every Jesuit community around the world, you know, to say what's most important to you, and if some of these places along the line, there were also lay people were invited. Said, what should Jesuits be doing? So this is all over the world, and it looked pretty messy most of the way along. But as it went on, people began to have a sense that this is really, I think the Holy Spirit is really at work here. You know, I think something more has happened. And so when they finally got done, I won't read the paragraph from them, but they just said, well, we were kind of skeptical about this is as they wrote it when they're all done. They said, we're kind of skeptical this will really amount to anything. And yet the preferences that we're sharing, we are really convinced that these came out of the Spirit. So it's really a Spirit-led set of preferences. I mean, and animated, which I find, you know, very consoling. And I think, let me just say one thing about corporate communal discernment. It really, it's based on the fact that every person is the Spirit in life, is alive with the Spirit. Every person has something to say. So every person needs to be respected. Every person needs to be listened to. This is slow, messy, takes a lot of discipline to really hear each other out. And I think the grace that God gave the Jesuits and our colleagues was we really were willing to go through this 16-month process. Most Jesuits say, well, can we just say we'll do? Let's just have a meeting. Let's have an agenda. Let's get it done and move on. So I think, you know, and what if this, even the communal discernment is rooted in each individual's discernment, that each person has to be in touch with their own lives and have that interior freedom to listen to someone and respect another person. So I think it's really an exciting process. It's a very collaborative process, and behind all the Jesuit apostolic works, I think, is much more that they're all done out of a spirit of collaboration, not just the Jesuits. When I got the Jesuit retreat house, the director made all the decisions, and I said, could we maybe spread this out and come together and corporately begin to make up some of these decisions? And this is the place, I think, the direction the society is moving. The last thing I would really say, I think the next three preferences really just flow out of this discernment process that the society went through with its colleagues and itself. And when you listen to God intently, the next three preferences are what you hear.
The second universal apostolic preference: to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice. Since the founding of the Society of Jesus in 1540, the Jesuits gather as a body, representative body, and it's done 36 times. They're called general congregations. And at those gatherings, we generally elect our general. One other thing we may do is in particularly interesting, difficult, neuralgic times, we talk about the state of the world. And one time we did that was in the 32nd General Congregation of the Society after Vatican II. And a prime objective of the Society was articulated in Decree 4 of that General Congregation. The Society dedicated itself to the service of faith and promotion of justice by stressing the ministry of reconciliation, which calls the Society to develop, quote, a deeper grasp of the movements, aspirations, and struggles in the hearts of our contemporaries. Close quote. The Christ we ourselves encounter in the spiritual exercises is the Christ we want to share with others. Or, as General Congregation 34 phrased it, a Jesuit seeks freely to give what he has freely received, the gift of Christ's redeeming love. Close quote. It's the Christ who we want not just to know, not just to love, but also to serve among the poor, the young, and by cherishing and protecting the wonders of creation. What has Father General said about the second Universal Apostolic Preference? He writes, the path we seek to follow with the poor is one that promotes social justice and the change of economic, political, and social structures that generate injustice. This path is a necessary dimension of the reconciliation of individuals, peoples, and their cultures with one another, with nature, and with God. Furthermore, he says, we confirm our commitments to care for migrants, displaced persons, refugees, and victims of war and human trafficking, and resolve to defend the culture of the dignified existence of indigenous peoples. That is something that's illustrative. It's not something that defines how far we're going to go, right? Because questions of racism, questions of sexism, questions of economic stratification is going to all be included in this. So why does the Society of Jesus care about this? Is this just political correctness or do-gooder mentality on steroids, right? Oh, you like to care for your neighbor. That's nice. I collect stamps myself, right? That can't be it. What have the suffering to do with the idea of serving Christ laid out in the 34th General Congregation? Ignacio Ellacuría, the former rector president of the University of Central America in El Salvador, proposed an important theological category in the 1980s, that of the crucified people. According to Ellacuría, the crucifixion of people is the product of actions in human history. And this crucified people is the continuation of the history of the life and death of Jesus Christ. What does that mean? For Ellacuría, as he contemplated the poverty endemic throughout the world, he saw a collective body, a majority of humankind, which owes its situation of crucifixion to the way society is organized and maintained by a minority that exercises its dominion, sometimes unwittingly, through a series of factors which, taken together and given their concrete impact upon history, must be regarded as sinful. In history, humanity is crucified in this concrete form of the crucified people. And so when we as believers reflect on the mangled reality of the crucified people, we must inquire, what is there of sin and the need for salvation precisely there? The crucified people is the victim of the sin of the world. And, says Ellacuría, it's also the bearer of the world's salvation. We'll remember Holderlin's poem, near, near, and difficult to grasp is the Almighty. But where the fire is, there also lies the salvation. So how do we come close to the fire? How do we come closer to the crucified people? In a university context, we need to develop the capacity to study profoundly the world's economic and social problems. We need to develop a focus not merely on individuals who are either good or not so good, and consider broad systemic and structural patterns that result in some being perpetually excluded from sitting at the table of plenty. What do I mean? In the United States, only one child in 25 who is born in the bottom economic quintile will ever rise to the top quintile of income in the country. By contrast, in Denmark, 1 child in 6 who is born in a family in the bottom fifth of income rises to the top fifth of income. There are structural reasons why children are so locked in poverty in the United States. We should be able to identify these reasons in a Jesuit university and propose ways to work against the structures embedded in our society. Over 44% of the jobs in the United States are described as low-wage jobs. Those working them do not rise above the poverty level of $27,500 a year for a family of 4. These low-wage jobs offer no benefits, no sick days, no days off, no health insurance, no pension. How many of the people working in these jobs are employed by graduates of Jesuit universities? How is it that the products of our years of rigorous education failed the lesson of teaching them to see their sisters and others as made in the image and likeness of God, who have an inherent dignity? When will we see wages, benefits, social security net as a question of theological import, where God is revealed? Another issue, poverty is gendered. In 2018 in the US, 10.6% of men and 12.9% of women lived below the poverty line. The poverty rate for a single parent family with no wife present, 12.7%. For a single parent family with no husband present, the poverty rate was 24.9%. How can we in a Jesuit university be silent on the rank sinfulness of sexism, to say nothing of racism, in any political theory, economic, social science course worth the name? How can we elide the suffering of peoples with categories that ignore the cry of the poor? Our ministry is our work in education, and we need to focus on the world as it is and strive to meet the crucified people where they are. And when we meet them, we must know that we behold the very face of God, whose dignity can never be slighted or ignored. We're called to reach out to the estranged, the vulnerable, and the alienated. We want those who are part of our educational mission to dream of and build step by step a new culture based on gospel values. In all our work, we want to unite people where they're separated, to heal them where they're wounded. We want to work collaboratively in what Pope Francis calls the field hospital of the world, remembering Paul VI's admonition, without justice, there is no peace. Finally, we want to bring hope to our world, to imagine new roads and to walk these roads to the end. Anything less than working towards these aims is, I think, failing in the mission we Jesuits have been given.
On the third Universal Apostolic Preference, our Father also says in his letter, is complementary to the poor, because he says the poor and the young are theological places. So we can, and we must find God in those who are crucified, but also in those who are part of the renewal of the planet. When I was reading these apostolic preferences, and then when I realized that, wait a moment, why am I in this panel? And because I'm the youngest here? And that is great, because for this panel, I'm the youth. In other groups, I'm just another old dude. And that is something really interesting. And I have been kind of remembering John's gospel at the beginning of chapter 20, when, remember, after the woman returned and said that something had happened with Jesus' body, apparently is not in the town. So we heard that Peter and the beloved disciple ran. We infer that one was younger than the other, so a rabbit the first, and needed to wait for Peter to go inside. And it is not until Peter goes inside that the other disciple also enters, and they both understand what had happened and believe. And after believing and understanding, they walk back together. And I think that we can think and theorize and make beautiful proclaims about the youth and describe in a very hopeful way how the youth will be the salvation. But if we are not putting some skin on this game, we can just remain theorizing and praising the youth, praising young people, and somehow regretting that we are not so young anymore. So probably it's better to understand this work to journey with youth, a journey that demands us to do this together. So for me, coming from Latin America, it's really kind of part of my mother's milk that we need to defer to the elders and we need to respect the elders. And this passage is kind of great example. Wait for Peter to arrive and go inside. But after these months of discernment, what the society is proposing here is kind of tricky, bold twist. It's saying, okay, it's not just enough with waiting for the elders, but we need to work with the youth, following their path. And I think that changes a lot. So what I would like to emphasize is that it's not about we the old or we the young and them the old, them the young, or whichever way we want to do it. But it's that the only way to build a future that is filled with hope is if we both, the young and the old, work together. And in this sense, Pope Francis, in his book, Result of Interviews, published in 2020, Let Us Dream, remind us that this beautiful passage from Joel's prophecy, that when Joel says, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And Francis says, the future will be born from the conjunction of the youth and the young and the old. As Francisco Luis Bernardes, an Argentine poet, puts it, at the end of it all I have understood that what on the three flowers lives from what is buried. And I think the Pope is pointing out something that is part of our problems today. We are being part of a society that relegates either the young or the elders. And in this relegation of both ends of life is impoverishing itself. The Pope says, the abandonment of the elderly deprived of the visions of the youth, the young, and the impoverishment of the young deprived of the dreams of the old, creates a society that dries up, becomes foodless, and sterile. And I think that is a huge problem. So maybe that's also the reason why the Pope insists that it's time for a new fraternity that help us to overcome the hyperinflation of the individual, the denial of traditions, and even the canceling of convictions, including those shared histories and religious heritage. We are in a Jesuit institution, and we recognize that a renewed humanism could be the possibility to reunite us, to rejoin. It's the same root of religion, to put us together on a base and a more universal, including intergenerational fraternity that, in words of Pope Francis, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, implies both solidarity and social friendship. But this solidarity and social friendship lies upon the basic recognition of the equal dignity of every human being and the necessity for all to work together for a common good. If one of those two ends kind of flows, we can be justified by religious convictions or religious or ideas to deny dignity of people and keep crucifying them and justify that under the Lord's words or any ideology. So, in this sense, the third universal apostolic preference that should guide our work during these years, 2019 to 2029, is calling us not only to make the journey with youth, but to do that together and to listen to them and be bold enough to engage in this intergenerational connection and relationship that can create new forms of solidarity and social friendship. That's the very first point. And for us here at Marquette, I have been thinking that what makes Marquette a university is not just the universal cultivation of truth and superior knowledge. We are here dealing with the students who are maturing and learning to become adults and professionals, and who will engage social life as adults and professionals, and will show there in their intergenerational relationships what they have learned here. And if Marquette says, be the difference, and if be the difference is more than a marketing strategy, probably that put us in a big challenge. Be the difference supposed to be able to accompany every student and every person that we encounter here in the best possible way to help this person to attain the fullest of his or her potential. And that's part of what Father Sosa says in this third Universal Apostolic Preference. Working with the youth, journeying with them, trying to create a better future implies creating conditions that allow all to develop their full potential as human beings. And those are not simple words. Probably that put us kind of to rethink what is the end of offering higher education. It's not just about cultivating knowledge. I insist, it's about helping people to mature and become adults and professionals who can make the difference through the possibility of enact friendship and social responsibilities, which in Francis' words is solidarity and social friendship. And in Ignatian jargon is the combination of being cared for, the result of cura personalis, and a development of the commitment to learn to discern toward the greatest good, that is the realization of the magic. So if we take these two, being the poor and the youth, theological places, probably we can reflect on it and move forward to help others to care for our common plan.
Thank you. The fourth preference, to collaborate in the care of our common home. The fourth preference clearly takes its inspiration from Pope Francis's revolutionary encyclical Laudato Si, in which the Pope calls for a commitment to what he calls integral ecology. Dan Castillo of Loyola, Maryland, describes Pope Francis's vision as follows. Integral ecology is a political ecological concept. It expresses Pope Francis's vision of how humanity is called to organize rightly the interrelated ecological and socio-economic dimensions of the world, so that the world might reside more deeply within the fullness of life. For the Pope, the realization of an integral ecology demands that societies be fundamentally oriented toward making a preferential option for the earth and the poor. In other words, in learning to hear and respond to the cries of the earth and the poor in history, the human person also learns to rightly care for the garden of the world, and thereby can begin to repair the bonds of communion for which the human has been created. This vision contrasts radically with the dominant neoliberal economic paradigm of our world today: unregulated growth, technological progress, unlimited exploitation of nature, greed, increased consumption, and the rejection of limitations on the actions of the powerful. Pope Francis describes this system as organized around the standard of Satan. Commenting on the fourth preference, Father Sosa makes the following commitment. The damage done to the earth is also damage done to the most vulnerable, such as indigenous peoples, peasants forced to emigrate, and the inhabitants of urban peripheries. The environmental destruction being caused by the dominant economic system is inflicting intergenerational damage. Not only does it affect those now living on earth, particularly the very young, but it also conditions and jeopardizes the life of future generations. We resolve, considering who we are and the means that we have to collaborate with others in the construction of alternative models of life that are based on a respect for creation and on a sustainable development capable of producing goods that, when justly distributed, ensure a decent life for all human beings on our planet. The preservation over time of the conditions of life on our planet is a human responsibility of immense ethical and spiritual importance. The connection between the fourth preference and preferences 2 and 3 should be evident. It is difficult to imagine a hope-filled future spoken of in preference 3 without addressing the existential crisis of climate change. In fact, young people are in the vanguard of those struggling for environmental justice. And we cannot walk with poor people without recognizing their vulnerability to negative environmental impacts. Poor people and people of color are much more likely to suffer ecological harm. And it is easy to trace the location of landfills, toxic waste dumping, and polluting industries to the racial makeup of neighborhoods, and nations. Preference 4 urges us to be cognizant of the relation between ecological and social injustice. Kathleen Smythe of Xavier University suggests an adaptation of what is called the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm to address ecological challenges. These are her suggestions for what she calls Ignatian pedagogy for sustainability. First, truth, honesty, and humility, assuming an honest and humble attitude in the face of the challenges ecological damage poses, recognizing their complexity and the depth of commitment needed to address them. Second, experience, the need for multiple modalities of knowledge: scientific, cultural, humanistic, and experiential. Third, reflection, the willingness to take the time to understand the issues and use our imaginations to address them. 4, action, community building, service, and working for social change, both locally and globally. And 5, evaluation, recognizing and acting on the scientific truths of our interdependence with the natural world and being attentive to the lessons learned. Marquette University has already taken several steps consistent with Preference 4, and you can find them on the website at marquette.edu/sustainability. The preferences must guide the university in both its teaching and research activities, as well as in how it interacts as an institution with the environment and the society in which it finds itself. It is up to every member of the university community to call it to carry out its responsibilities.